Welcome, glad you're here. In the glittering world of celebrity, bright stage lights and shiny trophies often mask a darker reality. What the public sees isn't always the truth. Behind the charm, the talent, and the flawless smiles, many famous black icons found themselves caught in secret relationships that shattered their carefully built images. From endless nights of partying in luxury hotels to high-pressure tours and the constant fear of exposure, their hidden desires led to scandal, emotional collapse, and lives spiraling out of control. And the 21 stories I'm about to reveal will strip away every illusion. These are the stars who appeared perfect in public, while privately living lives far more complicated and chaotic than anyone ever imagined. Eddie Long was a powerful pastor who hid a deeply depraved double life behind the glow of spiritual authority. As the famed leader of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Georgia, he commanded enormous influence within America's religious world. He carefully crafted an image of strength and righteousness, a no-nonsense man of God whose thunderous sermons and commanding presence drew in thousands of devoted followers. From the pulpit, he projected moral certainty. But behind closed doors, that image was quietly rotting. By the early 2000s, cracks began to form. Hidden beneath the robes and scripture was a dark, secret gay sex life built on manipulation and control. Between 2000 and 2010, Eddie Long slowly transformed his role as a pastor into a weapon, targeting young men who lacked family support and emotional stability. The Longfellows Youth Academy became the gateway into his private world. Church trips, overnight spiritual retreats, and religiously framed explanations gradually pulled these young men into a dangerous cycle of dependence. Long never rushed. He moved with patience and precision, using lavish gifts, cars, cash, jewelry, luxury vacations, even access to private planes, to make his victims feel chosen and protected. He insisted they call him Dad, referred to them as his spiritual sons, and built bonds fueled by authority, trust, and twisted emotional control. Once loyalty was secured, the abuse escalated. What began as massages turned into forced sexual acts, including oral sex and worse, all cloaked in scripture, falsely labeled as spiritual discipline or training. Many of the victims were young, vulnerable, and easy to manipulate. One by one, names like Maurice Robinson, Anthony Flagg, Jamal Paris, Spencer Legrand, and Santino Kemp became trapped in his web. Fear, shame, and financial dependence kept them silent for years. It wasn't until 2010, when the weight became unbearable, that the 5 men filed lawsuits together, exposing a decade-long pattern of abuse. In 2011, the cases ended in an out-of-court settlement for a large undisclosed sum, sending shockwaves through the public. Yet even after the scandal, Eddie Long continued appearing as a righteous pastor, until his death from cancer in 2017, leaving behind a legacy forever stained by betrayal. Kelly. Once a towering R&B superstar, he turned the glow of the stage into a shield for a life of chaos and control. Kelly ruled the charts with hit after hit, shaping American music and selling the image of a powerful mentor with fame, money, and the ability to launch young dreams. But behind the spotlight, from the 1990s through the 2010s, ran a far darker story. His world became a closed system where fame was used as bait. Teenage boys with hopes of singing careers were drawn in by promises of guidance, private studio sessions, invitations to his Chicago home, endless days on tour. Inside, everything moved by Kelly's rules. Daily routines, time, even personal autonomy were tightly controlled. Abuse repeated itself, sometimes secretly recorded, those files later used as chains of fear to keep victims silent and trapped. Some were coerced into acts meant to break resistance and erase boundaries under his cold supervision. One was Louis, just 17, who met Kelly at a McDonald's. What looked like a lucky break quickly became the start of exploitation. Another, Alex, was pulled in at 16 between 2006 and 2007, sinking deeper into a web of manipulation tied to Kelly's inner circle. Years passed in silence, dependence, and terror, leaving lasting trauma. It wasn't until the federal trials in New York from 2021 to 2022 that the truth fully surfaced. Detailed testimony from male survivors exposed how Kelly weaponized stardom to dominate and control. The final verdict, a 30-year prison sentence, shut the door on one of music's darkest chapters, a brutal reminder of the cost of abusing power. Afrika Bambaataa. Hailed as the godfather of hip-hop, a street culture prophet, and the founder of the universal Zulu nation, Afrika Bambaataa was once seen as the bridge between raw street music and a generation's rebellious soul. In New York's boroughs, his name carried protection, respect, and power. But behind the myth was a far darker reality, one that slowly rotted the image of a cultural icon. At the Bronx river houses, where Bambaataa lived and where vulnerable teens gathered, his influence became a weapon. As a trusted leader and mentor, he offered safety, belonging, and opportunity. Then came the grooming, quiet, calculated, and relentless. Compliments turned personal. Private workout sessions were held in his apartment. Boys were told they were chosen, special, different. What began as vague touches escalated into repeated abuse, tightening control through fear, shame, and authority. Victims later described being trapped in enclosed spaces where power crushed resistance. In some cases, Bambaataa allegedly handed them off to other adult men in exchange for money or favors, standing by as a director, treating young bodies like currency. In 1980, a 15-year-old named Ronald Savage became one of those victims. It would take him nearly a decade to speak out. Others followed, Hassan Campbell among them, but their voices were buried under the weight of Bambaataa's legendary status. It wasn't until 2016 that the accusations finally exploded into public view, sending shockwaves through the hip-hop world and shattering the untouchable image of one of its founders. A major lawsuit filed in 2021 dragged on quietly until 2025, when Afrika Bambaataa lost by default after failing to appear in court. A silent fall, but a fitting end for someone who used power, trust, and culture to prey on unprotected kids. Chris Stokes. Chris Stokes, the powerhouse manager behind some of the biggest R&B acts of the early 2000s, hid a dark and twisted life behind the glitter of showbiz. Known as the man who propelled B2K to stardom, he wielded total control over the careers of young performers, managing schedules, shaping images, and holding their dreams in his hands. But behind that glossy exterior was a horrifying abuse of power. Chris's secret gay sex life crossed every moral line. It began with boys as young as 11 or 12, stepping into the industry with complete trust, only to be manipulated by a manager who turned influence into coercion. Shared showers, framed as part of normal work routines, became gateways for inappropriate touching. Molestation escalated over time, evolving into forced sexual acts. No threats were necessary. The mere promise of stage time, contracts, or continued career opportunities was enough to silence fear and shame. Resistance was crushed before it could even form. By 2007, the carefully guarded secrets began to unravel. Rasby, real name Diario Thornon, went public about being molested at a young age. YouTube videos and later interviews also named Quindon Tarver, adding more weight to the growing accusations against Stokes. The revelations spread shockwaves through the entertainment world. Chris Stokes continued to deny the allegations, yet over the years, multiple witnesses and consistent abuse patterns emerged. Ultimately, the case ended with an out-of-court settlement. There was no public verdict, but the story left lingering questions about the dark side of entertainment power and how it can be abused for personal desires. And for the kids involved, the scars, both mental and physical, last a lifetime. Little Richard, the rock and roll legend who lit up stages with a blazing energy, only to slip into the shadows of his private life. Little Richard wasn't just a performer, he was a revolution, shattering musical, stylistic, and cultural norms with hits like Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally. He influenced generations of artists, redefining what it meant to be bold, fearless, and unapologetic. But behind the dazzling lights, his life took a darker, wilder turn. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Little Richard lived openly as a bisexual. He called himself omnisexual, engaging with men and women alike. His homes and hotel rooms in Los Angeles and New York became notorious for wild, all-night parties where boundaries melted. In his autobiography, he admitted organizing orgies with fellow male artists and models, viewing it as an inevitable consequence of fame. Money flowed freely, hiring male companions, and the nights stretched endlessly in pursuit of pleasure. Yet by the 1970s, chaos caught up with him. Cocaine, heroin, and PCP became constant companions, eroding his health over decades. Chronic heart disease and late-stage bone cancer ravaged his body, destroying his sexual function. Desire remained, but his body could no longer keep pace. Erectile dysfunction grew severe, eventually eliminating the ability to perform entirely. In his own words, drugs and illness decimated the once fiery passion that had defined his life. Little Richard's final years were marked by the bitter consequences of decades of excess, a life both brilliant and broken. When he passed in 2020, the world lost a rock and roll icon, but behind the legend lay the darker shadows of a life lived without limits. Gordy, the legendary Motown mogul who brought black music to the heart of mainstream America, creating an empire that launched icons like the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, and the Jackson 5. He was the ultimate power broker of the music world for decades. But behind the spotlight, a hidden life unfolded. At Motown's peak, Gordy's discreet bisexual relationships with young male artists ran alongside the empire he controlled. Private offices, Detroit and Los Angeles villas, recording contracts, release schedules. Careers were quietly influenced by these secret entanglements. Power was in one hand, ambition in the other, and many young stars, hungry for fame, were drawn into a subtle but potent web of manipulation. Late-night sessions and private meetings blurred lines of morality, and Motown's closed hierarchy allowed these relationships to persist for years, unnoticed. Everything shifted in the 1990s when Gordy was hit with severe type 2 diabetes. The disease silently ravaged his body, blood vessels, nerves, and the very foundation of sexual function. By his 70s, erectile dysfunction became pronounced, and even medication couldn't restore what had once been a tool of control. Gordy entered a stark, lonely reckoning. The empire remained, but the private life that had once thrived in secrecy was finally forced to close. Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones, legendary producer, concealing a chaotic private life. A towering figure in the world of music, he shaped hundreds of blockbuster projects and guided icons like Michael Jackson and Frank Sinatra. He's synonymous with creative genius, influence, and deep, rare connections across decades of entertainment. But behind the polished image of a music mastermind lay a complicated personal life. At the height of his career, Quincy Jones maintained discreet bisexual relationships with several famous male artists, often within the confines of private Los Angeles villas and recording studios. Many of these encounters were fleeting, yet they followed a familiar pattern. His power and prestige opened doors to quick connections with aspiring singers and musicians chasing their shot in the industry. Late nights, marathon recording sessions, and unmentioned meetings with the media became a normal rhythm, and his status ensured silence around his private life for years. By the 1980s, the story shifted. Quincy was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, a silent disease slowly gnawing at his body. Over time, complications emerged, most notably severe erectile dysfunction. In his autobiography and later interviews, he admitted that he lost natural erections by age 60. Medications became necessary, but their effectiveness waned over the years. Combined with a history of alcohol use and relentless work intensity, the sexual vitality tied to his once wild life gradually faded. Quincy later reflected that the illness didn't just damage his body, it drained his sexual desire, leaving his final years shadowed by impotence and disappointment, despite every attempt to reclaim what was lost. Bill Cosby. Once America's beloved TV dad, Cosby hid a darker truth behind the picture-perfect family image he projected. At the peak of his fame with The Cosby Show, he was the face of comedy, a symbol of trust and success for millions. For decades, he ruled entertainment, a respected, powerful figure whose name alone could make or break careers. But behind the curtain of fame, a very different story unfolded. Cosby's gay sexual encounters occurred quietly, often entangled with harassment of young men in the industry. Film sets, hotels, and other spaces he frequented became arenas where boundaries were pushed, and refused requests could come at the cost of a career. Control thrived in silence and fear. Harassment became routine, but his public persona was so untouchable that few dared to question it. By the 1990s, his private life began to unravel in a different way. Years of unrestrained sexual activity led to severe erectile dysfunction, documented in medical records. Though stimulant medications offered temporary relief, the effects faded, and aging compounded the decline. The once wild sexual life stagnated, top commands, bottom refuses. In 2018, Cosby was convicted for drugging and sexually assaulting Andrea Constant, but the stories of male victims largely remained in the shadows. Their silence, complex and layered, persisted even as public focus shifted. By 2021, procedural rulings from the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction, leaving the full truth tangled between fame, fear, and secrecy. Sherman Hemsley. Sherman Hemsley, the TV legend, hid a twisted private life behind the bright glow of Hollywood lights. Known to millions as George Jefferson in The Jeffersons and later the star of Amen, Hemsley's career soared for decades, bringing fame, fortune, and an untouchable status as a cultural icon. But behind the screen's cranky, lovable persona was a man living a very different reality. Starting in the 1970s, Hemsley's private life took a sharp, hidden turn. Beneath the public image of the gruff, witty dad was a man engaged in secretive, chaotic bisexual relationships. Young actors and backstage staff became part of a shadowy world that unfolded quietly in his Los Angeles apartment, and later, hotel rooms after shoots. Fame made access easy, control simple, and silence almost mandatory. By the 1980s, these encounters had become frequent, fast, and emotionless. They were no longer about pleasure, they were about escape, a way to dodge the crushing pressure of fame and the gnawing loneliness it brought. Yet the double life, once thrilling, slowly became a heavy burden. By the 1990s, his once vibrant sexual escapades had dwindled, and Hemsley's health began a rapid decline. Years of alcohol abuse led to cirrhosis, quietly ravaging his body. Erectile dysfunction compounded his struggles, leaving him dependent on medication that eventually failed. Desire faded, ego remained. In his final years, impotence carved a hollow that no fame, no memory of past glories, could ever fill. Marion Barry. Marion Barry, the powerful mayor with messy secrets hidden behind the public spotlight. Four-time mayor of Washington, D.C., he wielded immense influence in urban politics, rallying voters and leaving a bold, controversial mark for decades. From the 1970s, when his power began to bloom, Barry's private life took a darker, more tangled turn. Discreet gatherings across the city became spaces where he sought gay encounters in the shadows, blending sex with power and control. Young male aides and city staff, hungry for advancement, gradually got caught in a dependent spiral, physical closeness becoming a twisted guarantee of loyalty and political support. This undercurrent quietly pulsed through government halls, invisible to most but impossible to ignore for those inside. It wasn't until the 2000s that the full picture began to unravel, piece by piece. Chronic kidney failure, fueled by diabetes and the lingering effects of past addictions, ravaged his body, disrupting hormones, circulation, and vitality. Desire remained, but his body betrayed him. Erectile dysfunction turned intimacy into awkward struggle. Stimulants and vacuum devices became desperate attempts to cling to a vanishing sex life, often with little effect. Invitations that once thrilled became burdens. Calls for closeness turned heavy and taxing. No amount of political power could rescue a decaying body. In 2014, Marion Barry died from heart disease, closing a 78-year life where political brilliance intertwined with shadowed private desires. Behind his public triumphs and citywide forums, his messy, hidden sexual life lingered as a stark reminder of where power, lust, and calculated alliances collided. Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson, civil rights titan with a private, conflicted gay life. Known as a relentless fighter for justice, founder of the Rainbow Push Coalition and multiple-time presidential candidate, his name is tied to sweeping social campaigns, electrifying speeches, and decades of political influence. From the 1980s, when his power and prominence peaked, another, darker side of Jackson's life quietly unfolded, inside private offices and discreet hotel rooms during his endless travels. Twisted gay liaisons began to surface, drawing in young male aides desperate for advancement, who became entangled in a web of desire and control. Jackson's leadership became a weapon, career promises a lure. By the late 1990s, tragedy struck. Thyroid disorders quietly ravaged his body, severely damaging his blood and sexual nerve systems, leading to loss of erectile function. From 2000 onward, an exhausting cycle took hold, relentless craving clashing with physical decline. Even with medications and thyroid treatments, the damage was irreversible. Political pressures, advancing age, and unrelenting illness wore him down, leaving his sex life frozen. Relationships once built on dependence and fear crumbled into emptiness. No pleasure, only a thick sense of failure. Clarence Thomas. Supreme Court Justice. A man cloaked in power, hiding scandals behind the robe. Clarence Thomas, you've known the name. On the nation's highest court since 1991, wielding unmatched influence over historic rulings, a titan of the judicial system, and a political figure shaping Washington since the 1980s. But behind the prestige, a darker private life lingered. At the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the office became a stage for secrets, pressuring male subordinates, whispered proposals, silent touches, an atmosphere thick with tension. These allegations only surfaced publicly during his 1991 Senate confirmation, casting shadows over his image. No conviction followed, thanks to out-of-court settlements. By the 2000s, Thomas paid a private price. Sleepless nights, relentless nightmares, and diabetes silently ravaged his body, damaging circulation and nerves. Desire remained, but the ability faded, effectively ending the hidden abuses that once thrived in the shadows. Luther Vandross. Behind the legendary voice of this R&B icon was a private life few ever saw. Known for his velvety, soul-stirring vocals and a string of timeless hits that dominated the charts, Luther's influence on music ran deep, from the 1970s through the height of his fame. But offstage, his life was lived in shadows. Luther, a gay man, kept his relationships strictly private, intimate encounters with male partners quietly confined to tour hotels, recording studios, or apartments in New York and Los Angeles. His partners were often backup singers, musicians, or close friends in the industry, people who understood the unspoken rules and respected the secrecy. For decades, that careful discretion protected his public image. By the late 1990s, severe obesity took a toll on his health. Weighing over 330 pounds, Luther suffered serious damage to his cardiovascular and sexual health, including erectile dysfunction that forced him to cancel dates with partners, building quiet frustration and disappointment. In 2005, he passed away from a stroke linked to obesity and diabetes, closing a life where the dazzling stage lights sharply contrasted with a hidden, shadowed private world. Al Sharpton. Publicly, he's the civil rights leader, the organizer of massive protests, a presidential contender, a figure of deep influence in politics and social life. But behind the spotlight and the fiery speeches from the 1980s through the 2000s, a shadowed private life simmered with whispered rumors. Al Sharpton maintained discreet bisexual relationships with certain male aides and associates, often in private New York offices or hotel rooms on nationwide trips. His status as a leader acted as a shield, keeping these secrets hidden for years, known only to a few insiders. By the 2000s, after dramatic weight loss for his health, his body began to decline. Weakness and illness disrupted his sexual function, and even supportive medications faltered under the relentless pressure of work and age. Desire remained, but action became impossible, leaving his private life trapped in a deadlock, a tense intersection of power, hidden relationships, and failing health. The result was a period of deep torment, private and inescapable. Magic Johnson. A name synonymous with basketball greatness, five-time NBA champion, and the heart of the Los Angeles Lakers. For decades, he was the model of the ideal athlete. Talented, charismatic, and a family man admired from the 1980s through the 90s. But behind the bright lights of the arena and the roaring crowds, a very different story unfolded. Whispers of his private life circulated quietly, relationships with men that were kept discreet, shared only with select athletes, coaches, and insiders. These encounters were consensual, passionate, and far from mundane. Everything changed in 1991 when Johnson was diagnosed with HIV. The news forced him into sudden retirement and launched him into a new role as a leading advocate for AIDS awareness, transforming public perception of the disease. Yet the struggles didn't end there. By 2010, his once unstoppable body began to betray him. Years of a wild lifestyle, combined with the long-term effects of the virus, quietly led to sexual health challenges. Even with medication, his strength waned. What once came naturally no longer did, and over time, even treatment lost some of its power. Donnie McClurkin, the gospel powerhouse with Grammy wins, chart-topping albums, and a reputation as a spiritual icon from the 1980s through the 2000s. On stage, he was flawless, his voice soaring, his sermons stirring the faithful. But behind the pulpit, a very different story unfolded. McClurkin secretly engaged in gay relationships with male backup singers and choir members, encounters often hidden in church dressing rooms or hotel rooms during tours. He sometimes pursued younger men, all carefully concealed to protect his model pastor image. He later revealed that his struggles with sexuality traced back to abuse from an uncle and cousin, psychological scars that haunted him and shaped his choices. When he publicly admitted his past same-sex desires, claiming his faith had cured him, he described homosexuality as a deviation, a stance that drew sharp criticism from the LGBTQ+ community, labeling him homophobic. Meanwhile, his body began betraying him. Years of stress and diabetes triggered a severe sexual disorder, leaving him physically incapable of intimacy. The desires never disappeared, but his ability to act on them vanished. "Maybe that's the cure," he said, "thanks to my faith." Cuba Gooding Jr., Oscar-winning star hiding a darker, depraved side behind Hollywood's glimmer. Cuba rose to glory with his Oscar-winning role in Jerry Maguire, becoming a familiar face on screens and red carpets from the 2000s through 2020. But behind the fame, his private life spiraled. Bars and nightclubs in New York and Los Angeles became his hunting grounds, where booze-fueled nights escalated into out-of-control acts, later exposed publicly. He often targeted young male servers or patrons, using his star power to pressure them into unwanted contact, gropes, tight hugs, sudden touches. Everything happened fast, intensely, and always in silence. By 2022, he faced harassment charges as these actions came to light. From 2010 onward, his health declined sharply. An unhealthy lifestyle triggered sexual dysfunction. His body could barely respond even as desires remained high. Medications and aids gradually lost effectiveness. Pressure from alcohol and lawsuits pushed him further into a downward spiral, where fame, lust, and illness collided, leaving a chaotic sex life and a long, public downfall. Mystikal. Mystikal, the rapper known for his explosive energy, made a massive impact in the late 1990s and early 2000s with hit after hit, building a bold, cocky persona that drew fans in. Behind the music and macho image, however, lay a dark and twisted private life. Reports and court records paint a shocking picture. His New Orleans home and tour hotels were allegedly sites of coercive group sexual encounters. Mystikal reportedly used his status as a rapper to lure male staff and young fans, manipulating them under the influence of alcohol and stimulants. These chaotic, forced encounters eventually led to serious legal consequences, including sexual violence charges in 2004 and 2017. His high-profile career became forever shadowed by these acts, turning his private life into a notorious mark on his record. Nelly. Nelly, once the king of early 2000s rap, ruled the charts with massive hits and a flashy, hypermasculine image, promoting a straight-laced lifestyle from the 2000s into 2010. Behind the bright lights and sold-out tours, however, his private life was far darker. According to insiders, Tour buses and hotel rooms became secret spaces for clandestine gay encounters with both women and men, sometimes staff or fans, where his star power was used as leverage, with threats of firing or career damage to coerce compliance. Every scandal was tightly hidden to protect his public image. By 2010, the relentless partying, heavy drinking, and health decline began catching up to him. Medications barely worked, lasting only 2 or 3 minutes at a time. All of this remained under wraps until a 2017 lawsuit accused Nelly of forcing a woman on a tour bus, finally exposing some of the hidden gay ties, though many victims still stayed silent out of shame. CeeLo Green, the charismatic singer and rapper, famous for hits like Forget You and his roles in Goody Mob and Gnarls Barkley from the 2000s to 2010s, hid a darker side behind his eccentric public persona. As his fame soared, so did whispers about secretive parties in Atlanta and Los Angeles, where he was allegedly linked to illicit gay encounters. Reports claim he sometimes used ecstasy to manipulate victims, leading to sexual acts without consent. These allegations came to a head with a 2012 assault lawsuit, which was later settled out of court, leaving cracks in the star's carefully crafted image. Trey Songz. The carefully crafted image of Trey Songz as an R&B superstar and sex symbol began to crumble. Known for hits from albums like Ready and Trigger, he dominated the charts from the late 2000s through the 2010s, captivating fans with his seductive persona. But behind the fame, Trey Songz's life took a darker turn. He became entangled in private parties and chaotic one-night encounters in hotels across Los Angeles and New York, where he reportedly seduced male fans and staff with promises of career advancement, or, if they resisted, used threats and coercion to pressure them into sexual relationships. Alcohol often fueled these encounters, sometimes even leaving recordings that he used to maintain control and silence his victims. A decade later, the toll of this lifestyle became impossible to ignore. Trey Songz's relentless partying and sexual excess led to serious health issues, including severe erectile dysfunction at a young age. Therapy, medication, and every remedy he tried could only give fleeting results. Meanwhile, allegations from former male victims began to surface, pushing him to the edge as both his physical and mental health suffered under the weight of his past choices. The private lives of many black celebrities are often fraught with turmoil. What's your take on these revelations? Has your perspective shifted? Drop a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts and have honest conversations about the sides of celebrity life the public rarely sees. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next videos, where we continue to uncover hidden truths about the stars you thought you knew.